Okay.
Hello and welcome to this most recent episode of the Akkad and Coca Report. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. David Howard here. Dr. Howard is going to talk to us a little bit about his journey and talk to us after that about race in America. And he's got a unique perspective, especially given the fact that he's a doctor, a physician, an MD, PhD. So welcome, David. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Anish and Michelle. So first of all, a little bit of introduction. Like I said, I was born in the Caribbean, born in Jamaica, lived there for 18 years, and always wanted to be a doctor, came up to the US. My first home was the dorms, so I came straight up to the United States, to Hopkins as an undergrad. And obviously, kind of a cultural adjustment, but I ended up staying at Hopkins for 12 years, did undergrad and then stayed on for MD, PhD. And my PhD was actually on a women's health topic. And so that's kind of how I ended up in OBGYN. I looked at the birth outcomes of women who deliver while incarcerated. And so after that, I did residency. I was in University of Missouri, Kansas City. And then from there, 2012 or 2013 is when I graduated. It was kind of an interesting time. NIH funding was kind of up in the air, and a lot of the programs I applied to were kind of holding back. So in the end, I ended up joining the military. It is what it is, but I don't regret it. I got something out of it. And then from there on, came to Nevada, where I'm the director of research for a fellowship program, and also had a small clinical practice within that same practice for a few years. The last couple of years have been mostly on the academic side, and then now about to head back to the East Coast to take up a more traditional, full-fledged, academic medical position.
All right. Well, great. So, and so you've been, so this is basically since undergrad, you've basically been in the U.S. in some fashion or the other. That's great.
Yes. Yeah.
So we'll get into it. We'll get right into it, David. What are your thoughts on what's been going on now? You had a great thread. Part of the reason you're on, you're a very thoughtful guy on Twitter. And in a time where there's a lot of how do I put it kindly? A lot of shall we say bloviating and hot air type of hot takes. You're clearly somebody who has a very thoughtful insights, and so you had a thread yesterday where you started off talking about your experiences as a Black male, double doc, small business owner. So can you tell us a little bit about your perspective of what's been happening?
So I think that there are two separate questions that sometimes get conflated. So question number one, is there racial bias or racism? And question two, what is the role that plays? And I think sometimes, unfortunately, some people, they either conflate the two or they kind of go off the rails in one direction or the other. So it is possible to believe that racial bias exists, but simultaneously believe that it is not necessarily the biggest problem that's afflicting a particular group. And that's where sometimes, like I said, sometimes that's where the conversation kind of goes off the rails. So, I mean, my take, do I think that there's racial bias? Yeah, I mean, I've been in situations where, I strongly internally have felt in those situations that, if I were a white male in the same situation, it would not have happened. At the same time, I've benefited a lot from being in America. I'm a business owner. I went to Johns Hopkins, one of the best med schools in the country, and so on and so forth, And so I feel like, we've got to kind of step back and kind of really think, what is really what are some of the bigger issues at play, as opposed to just kind of saying it's all. So my problem with a lot of the conversations is that we tend to be reductionists and try to say the problem is all because of this, the problem is all because of that, you know. And in reality, it's more complex, you know. Like, for example, I'll just use one thing as an example. So for example, a lot of people will say that, oh, you know, 70% of, you know, African American babies are in single parent household. You know, that's a common statistic that people throw out. But then, as if we were to reverse that tomorrow morning, all the problems would end. And even if it would, like, well, how do you fix that, right? Are we going to force, you know, African American women to go marry everybody, you know? So it's like, you've got to kind of step back and realize that, I mean, it's more complex, it's more multidimensional. And, you know, so that's kind of why, because in reality, I mean, as we can probably all three agree on this, is that a lot of the ways that we've been approaching this problem, or what we think is the problem in this scenario, that led to everything that's going on, is, I mean, it hasn't been very productive, as you said. A lot of bloviating, a lot of people. Yeah.
So David, you brought up something. You know, you brought up something very interesting. You brought up those two questions. What? And you have a really unique perspective because you grew up for your childhood in Jamaica. Is that right? And then at 18, you
Yes.
came to this country.
Yes.
So I mean, Jamaica is a predominantly, you know, is almost entirely black. Correct? There's a small minority of whites that are there. Is that accurate?
Well, actually, in Jamaica, the second largest group is Indian.
Yeah, right. So black
Yeah.
and then Indian, correct?
Yeah. Kind of like Trinidad, although Trinidad has more. But yeah, I mean, Jamaica has, obviously, it's mostly black, overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Then I think the next major ethnic / racial group would be actually Indian, and then very tiny amount of people of European descent.
That's why some of my Jamaican friends, I always joke with them that I take credit for how good the Jamaican you know, goat curry is.
Yeah.
But you know, you grew up in a country that's predominantly black, and ostensibly you didn't face racial bias because of your skin color in Jamaica. Is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, so my journey has been interesting because, to be honest, I had to learn what it means to be African American, you know, because when I first came, I really wasn't. I mean, I was a Jamaican immigrant. That's not the same thing, you know. My parents did not live through the civil rights era like my true African American colleagues who have been here forever. Their parents, their grandparents, their great grandparents. I mean, their history and the stories, the culture, the history that has been passed down from generation to generation from my African American colleagues, who, you know, I call them true African Americans in the sense that they've been here for hundreds of years, as opposed to folks like myself who just migrated here 20 years ago. So when I first came, I mean, I really didn't understand. I didn't understand a lot of things. I mean, I didn't understand affirmative action. I didn't understand it because, again, coming from go ahead.
Were you automatically treated as a? Could you tell that you were being treated differently when you came here?
No, not initially. No, not in my first several years, because I came, you know, I was on the Hopkins campus. I just acted like everyone else. I mean, I kind of a weird thing to say, but if I was treated differently, I didn't notice it. Let's put it that way. But the one thing I did notice was my environment was obviously different, because now the biggest thing I noticed when I first came was that I went from being in Jamaica where all my teachers were black to now being on the campus of Johns Hopkins, where the overwhelming majority, probably in the 80s%, were whites, and then of the remaining 20s% were Asian, you know. So I had very few Black professors, and that was the most major change that I noticed. But beyond that, it took years before I really kind of assimilated to really understand some of what my African American colleagues, because I remember when I was at Hopkins, you know, I remember to this day as an undergrad, there's one day where there was a walkout in support of affirmative action. And I remember I was in class and a lot of the African American students, you know, got up and left. And I remember not getting it. You know, I didn't get it at the time, you know. But over time, you know, I've obviously assimilated and learned, and obviously have a more nuanced perspective now, you know.
Do you feel like there was more opportunity? I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you feel like there's more opportunity in the United States? Is that why you came to Johns Hopkins? You know, why not stay in Jamaica where, you know, ostensibly you wouldn't face, I mean, is that talked about in Jamaica, that, oh my goodness, when we go to America, we're going to get treated, you know, we're going to get treated differently. We're going to be treated as second-class citizens. Is that something that Jamaicans feel?
Not really. I think, I mean, it's hard to say. And it's probably changed now that there's enough Jamaicans who have migrated to America and lived here long enough. So for example, I mean, my aunt and uncle, I mean, they came in the very early 70s. You know, so that's now 40 years they've been here. And so, you know, I think things have changed. But no, when I was growing up, we were mostly focused, to be honest, on the economic opportunities. So, I mean, my aunt, who had came up 40 years ago, applied for us for green cards. It took a long time to get it because we were not her. It's my aunt, not my mother, you know. So when somebody who is not your direct parent applies for you for a green card, it can take a long time. So we actually waited 10 years from the time of application to when we got the green card. And it just so happened that when we got it, I happened to be 18. It's kind of just the way things worked out.
So, you know, it gets to that original question that we started, you brought up, you know, is there systemic racial bias in the United States? Is it a fair question to ask that if there is the level of systemic racial bias in the United States, which would result in the you know, in the conflagration that we've just seen with multiple cities kind of, you know, kind of boiling, if you will, correct? And there's so much rage. I mean, you know, folks are incredibly upset. Is it a fair question to ask if there is such a massive systemic racial bias in the United States where the color of your skin determines, you know, what happens to you? Why is it that, you know, that it seems like, you know, black men from Jamaica, not just black men, black men and women from Jamaica are you know, trying to come here from the 1970s on, because the economic opportunity afforded in this systemically racist society are, I guess, more than what they would be in, you know, Jamaica, which is, you know, predominantly black. Is that a fair question, or is that?
No, it's a fair question. And I think, you know, more than one things can be true at the same time. So I think, you know, like I said, and it actually ties right back to my initial separation before we went on air, is like, I think there's two questions at play. Number one, is there systemic racial bias? I think there is. I think in certain statistics, for example, I think the best statistic, and again, you know, there's, you know, I think there's a cliche that says there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, you know, and I'm a statistician too. So that's what my PhD was in epidemiology. But anyway, the most telling statistic, I think, is in the area of arrests for and prison sentences for drug use. And when they've looked at the criminology data and looked at, white Americans and Black Americans who are arrested for the same crime, I mean, they have noticed systemic difference in sentencing. And, you can't, I mean, how do you explain that? And similarly, just even the probability of being arrested for a particular drug, you see there's a systemic disparity. You think about the disparity between crack cocaine and between crack and cocaine, again, a disparity. So are there systemic disparities that fall along racial lines? There's definitely ample evidence to support that. But there's a parallel question, and the parallel question is that the reason for all of our problems? Is that uninsurmountable? So just because there is a bias, it doesn't mean it's not surmountable. And so to me, that's the bigger question. It's not whether there's bias. I think there is. I mean, we're human. Some people argue we all have bias, but I do believe there is systemic bias along racial lines in certain areas. However, the question is that is that it? Is that us? Can we in a reductionist manner just put everything to that? And the reason why I try not to do that, even as I acknowledge it, is because if we, in a reductionist manner, just say, listen, all of our problems is because of systemic racism, my fear is that we'll never fix anything,
Right.
And that's my fear.
Is your thought that, so the idea is clearly if you belong to a certain race, skin color, that sentencing, for instance, as you're saying, is very different. Is there any? You also followed up by saying that we're human, we have biases. Are there biases that exist that is it reasonable to have biases when it comes to certain groups of individuals? Like, should we have biases, or how should we, meaning if we're looking to have a constructive dialogue and figure out how to make things better, I guess the idea is to have fewer biases when it comes to groups of people. But is that, as you pointed out, it's a human thing to have bias. We have biases about lots of things. We have biases about what men can do, what women can do. We have biases about within India, for instance, we have biases about different groups of people. We have biases in the United States. We have a bias that that I remember as a college kid growing up. I came to the country when I was 10 years old, from India to Pittsburgh. I went to college. I remember, we had certain. I played a lot of basketball, and we had this fraternity organization where for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, for obvious reasons, the way they were broken up was there was like an Indian frat, there was like a Korean frat, there was a frat that was mostly Chinese, and there was like a frat that most of the kids were Muslim and Pakistani, and so those were the different basketball teams, right? And we all we played for 3 or 4 years in the same league once a year, and everyone and we all attributed personalities to those teams. We're like, oh, Kusa, man, the Korean squad, man, those guys are like incredibly tough, and these guys were they're a little soft on defense, and so we kind of generalized to the group. I don't know that obviously it's never right to individuals can obviously stand out among groups, but meaning there were certain characteristics. So not to be, I hope nobody gets upset with me, but the Chinese, the group of Chinese were were generally the shortest group that was there, right? Koreans were the heaviest group that was there. Again, I'm not I'm not generalizing. I don't want to get in trouble, but just there was these certain stereotypes that kind of came up, and And so we had biases. Like, I'm sure that, that's the bias that, you have, and that's your lived experience and stuff. Is it reasonable to have biases about groups?
Well, yeah. So here's where I think the distinction comes in, and I think this is probably the point that I think a lot of Black Americans try to make. Although I should be careful to speak for anyone but for myself. But I think the distinction comes in like this. Yeah, we all have bias, but when there's an asymmetry of power within a country, it doesn't matter which country it is, when you have multiple groups in a country, but one group distinctly and clearly has more power, then their bias has a lot more effect than the bias on the part of the other group. So, I mean, let's use tall people and short people as an example. So let's stay away from race for 2 minutes. So let's say you have a hypothetical country, and there's 70% tall people and 30% short people. And let's say that all the political power in that country is in the hands of the tall people. Now, let's say that the tall people in the country hate short people, and let's say that the short people hate tall people. They both have biases, but now in that country, the bias that's present on the part of the tall people who have all the political power, it has a lot more effect. So I think I think, an emphasis on the word I think, that is where, that is the subtle point that I think a lot of my African American colleagues are trying to make, is that it's not that Black people don't have biases and only white people have biases, but when a lot of the judges, the senators, the presidents, we've only had one Black president, every other president, we haven't even had a white female president, it's been all white men, judges, a lot of, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the gatekeepers of our institutions, even though we're very diverse, Black, Asian, et cetera, as you go higher up, the diversity decreases, and we still have a lot of institutions in America that govern our lives are still, it's just a matter of truth. It's still heavily, white males. And so the biases on the part of those individuals are going to have a much more dramatic impact, that, in
But
my opinion.
but most
Yeah,
of
in
the
my, yeah,
I understand. I understand. Most of but the population is mostly white, meaning blacks are African Americans are blacks are 13-14% of the total population. Um, is it a reasonable expectation that in order to see change, do we expect the majority of people, or do we expect a representative portion of that? And will that fix things? Because when I grew up, I grew up with this, I grew up watching many of the heinous stuff that, young Americans grow up seeing in terms of the history of racism that kind of is so deeply part of the American story. And, obviously, civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, we've seen, America was segregated until not long ago. The guard had to be called out to integrate schools and whatnot. So, and since then, there's been, just in the time I've been alive, there's been what appears to be a significant shift in that establishment power structure, right? And again, this is just one thing to pull out, but when Killer Mike, I don't know what he is. Why is he? I don't know what he is. He's a rapper. It must be some type of entertainment person. I don't know who Killer Mike is. You're muted. Sorry.
he's a rap artist.
Oh, he's a rap artist. Okay, so when Killer Mike was speaking, he gave a very powerful speech after the Atlanta riots, or Atlanta protests that turned a little violent, and he was flanked by the mayor of Atlanta and the police chief of Atlanta. And again, just in the 60s, this just wouldn't have been, this is exactly as you described. But now the Atlanta mayor is a black woman, and she's standing next to the police chief, who's the first openly gay female police chief. Minnesota, where this happened, right? The mayor is a black man. Baltimore, if you go down, Philadelphia, the police chief is black. The prior mayor, Jim Street, was black. Does it not seem like certainly in urban areas where the black community has a higher percentage of the population, that the power structure isn't white anymore? The power structure is black. So why is it then that we still are talking about? Why is it that we still talk about the same problems that we talked about, 30 some years ago?
Yeah, and that's a brilliant question. And I mean, that is the honest question that I don't feel like we've ever, um, you know, it's interesting. America used to be, and again, I didn't grow up here, so I have to talk from a historical context. There obviously used to be forced segregation, but now what I see in America is actually, and again, a lot of people really don't want to admit it, but what I see in America right now, which I actually think is dangerous, and we got to figure it out, is voluntary segregation. So we don't have forced segregation anymore, but we have a lot of self-segregation. If you look today sociologically at the way Americans voluntarily decide where to aggregate in terms of living, even in our school system, we're actually starting to see actually a lot of segregation. It's not forced, but it's voluntary. And sometimes I wonder, is this really a good thing or not? Because again, how are we solving the problem that we've been talking about? Or, and so going back to your original question, in urban areas where Blacks have self-aggregated, so I mean, it's not a coincidence that the overwhelming majority of the Black population are concentrated in certain areas, right? That's not an accident. It's a combination of a little bit of a history, but also a voluntary distribution. It's a combination of both. And so, yeah, in those areas, yeah, the power structure is definitely different. So why are those areas some of the areas hardest hit with a lot of societal ills?
Right.
And I'm not going to pretend to have the entire answer to that. I mean, but that is a question we need to answer: is why is it that even in the most densely populated areas, by densely populated, I mean areas with enough African Americans where they can have political power or have political say. I mean, if you're more than 25% of the population in a local city, I mean, you can have a big impact on the outcomes of elections and so on and so forth, and there's certainly, a number of African American cities where their representation approaches that threshold.
Yeah,
but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. It gets to this point about you understand the rage and the rage completely from the 1960s, over on down. I mean, 1970s. There's this, as you're saying, it's this feeling that like there's a lid being placed on by a power structure that's not black, and that may be biased. But are we saying that all these folks are? I mean, now that the power structure seems to have shifted, and certainly many of the major areas, what is it? But here, getting down to what why we're having this conversation is because of the kind of the heinous, atrocious thing that happened to George Floyd. Do you feel, you've been here 20 years, have you felt that? Have you felt the kind of police mentality, or do you feel this kind of systemic issue when you have interacted with the police as a black man here?
Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Fortunately, I haven't had a lot of, so one of my fortunate flaws is that I actually tend to drive very slow. And so, some people criticize me for it. A lot of my friends do. They're like, David, why do you drive so slow? So, well, the side effect of me driving like an old lady a lot of the times is that I never get caught for speeding. And so I haven't had too many, the honest truth is I haven't had too many experiences with the police, period. My denominator is so low, it would be a little bit dishonest of me to make any conclusions. Where I've seen more of the biases is actually in my encounter as an adjunct in the academic world.
Mm.
And that's where I started to see, as a medical student, resident, I felt certain biases, but at the same time, it comes back, and I'll keep driving the point home.
Can you,
The question is not what, can you hear me?
do you want to elaborate on those?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. On those biases,
Yeah, that's what I'm
on
saying.
what you felt as an adjunct professor? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is, for example, I felt subjectively that when my white colleagues who were residents, I felt like when they made mistakes, I felt like the consequences were less severe. And again, that's a subjective opinion. And, I'm going to freely admit that it's a subjective opinion. But, what I want to get at is a solution. And so the question is, how did I approach those situations? Yeah, I felt subjectively at certain points in my educational journey that I was maybe treated a little bit more harshly. But at the end of the day, my approach, and again, I'm just speaking for me, I can't put words in anybody else's mouth, is I just tried to look at the bigger picture. And, my thought process was, not everybody is like this person who might be treating me this way. And I just need to survive. I need to do my best. And the reality is that America is a big country. There's 50 states, it's a huge country. And so, the beauty is that, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to paper over the concerns of other people. But it's a large country. And one of the benefits of being in a very, very large country is if one area sucks, you can technically leave. You can go to another area,
How do you know when, and I talk about this, or I don't know if I've specifically talked to anyone about this on the podcast, but I've thought about this, that, when in talking to our female colleagues, and they frequently feel this brunt of, how they're treated differently because they're women, both by colleagues and the wider medical audience. And I've always wondered, how do you know that? How do you know that it's your gender or your color? Is it? As you're saying, it's pretty subjective, right? Like, how do you know that the person just doesn't? Through my career, my abrasive nature has not endeared me to quite a few people, and so and I don't. I'm not. How do we know that it's not? How do you know it's not you, and how do you know they are actually reacting to you based on your color? Because a lot of times, at least in our circumstances that we move through, which is these like kind of polite circumstances in medicine, whether it be academia or whatnot, the racism is not overt, correct? They're not calling you specific racial epithets, right? It's this kind of thing that you feel. I'll just give you one example. Like when I started a practice in this hospital system, it was weird because it felt like I was this everyone liked me, blah blah blah, and then I kind of started on my own, and suddenly like there was a little bit of a change in perspective and tone. And again, I'm I'm Indian, I'm brown, and a lot of the folks that were surrounding me are not. And I remember thinking that, I wonder if I was part of their tribe. I wonder if I went to their, you name it, church or synagogue or whatnot, right? Would they treat me the same way? Because and and I've always tried to reject that, because I just think that I'm somewhat of a competitor, if you will, and so yeah, so they're not going to be as nice to me as when I was in training and running around, doing all the dirty work and kind of helping them get home quicker, right? So I think you can I certainly could see an alternative place that I could get into, which I think would be just mentally bad, and I don't want to dwell on that. I don't want to I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that these are folks that thought X, Y, and Z of me at this point. The reason they think this of me now is not because of my skin color or not because I don't go to their church or synagogue, but it's because of we're just this is business, and there's no, don't get your feelings hurt, have a thick skin type of thing.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, it's hard to 100% know, although sometimes you can have, thoughts and strong thoughts, and, you might sometimes be right, and maybe occasionally, maybe you're reading into it. One thing I think, one comment that my second year resident made to me when I was an intern, and it's one of the few things I remember from residency, but it was very profound. And he said, David, whenever anyone criticizes you, search for that kernel of truth. A lot of times, yes, they may be over embellishing, they may have a bias against you, but search for that kernel of truth and try to fix it, And I remember that because, what he was really getting at was that, yeah, sometimes when people criticize you, it's going to seem like they're coming after you harder than other people. And in truth and in fact, he was actually acknowledging that indeed that's going to happen. That probably happens. So he wasn't denying that sometimes when you are criticized, it might seem unfair. And even a lot of what the person who is criticizing you is saying might be too much. Maybe they're going too far. But his point was search for that kernel of truth. And I think what he was saying is, don't focus on all the things that they're saying that are probably overkill, it's clear that they're going too far, and if they tell you that you're the worst resident in the world, I mean, you're not, so don't focus on all the things that are probably an exaggeration, but try to figure out if there's a kernel of truth in the criticism and use that as a way to be better. And
Right.
that's kind of been my personal motto going through medicine as a trainee and even as an attending is, when people hit you with criticism, don't get so hyped up about maybe the extreme things they're saying. Find and he was, because he was trying to comfort me after I got beaten down by my chief,
Right.
So yeah.
Sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, David. Jeff. Sorry if I'm being too personal. Jeff, do you have children? Are you married? Do you have kids?
No.
Okay. I mean, is that a possibility, or is it? I mean, is it something? I'm trying to. I'm wondering. I want to see it from your perspective. What would you think about raising Black kids in America today? What you think the consequences might be? Would that be a preoccupation that I think would be, would burden you more than it does, other folks, from the? I mean, how do you see that?
Well, it's a little bit hard for me to give a really strong opinion on that because, I've never raised any child.
Right.
So I've never really had to deal with the school system. I've never had to deal with Yeah, I've never had to
Mhm.
deal with that, so I don't
Uh,
know that I'm the
What
best
about your
person
extended, your family? You have family here. You mentioned you.
in different places from them, because my parents moved to Florida and I was in Baltimore. You know, my aunts and uncles are in New York. So for much of my academic life, I've been in cities where I don't really have that many relatives, just because of my academic journey.
I see.
Okay.
David, when it comes to this idea of um, not knowing for sure, right? And that's part of this part of the conversation when we start speaking about police brutality and systemic bias. Do you believe, based on talking to your, I know not based personally, because you drive 20 miles under the speed limit, but in speaking to your group of friends or your circle of friends that are Black, is it pretty obvious that that's the case, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I would say that the people that I know that, I think they fall into two categories in terms of the police. Either they have been lucky, like myself, in that they haven't just, their denominator is small in terms of number of encounters with the police, that they really haven't felt it that way. And then a second category of my African American friends who have felt it, either because they're older or just chance. But definitely, yeah. I mean, I have colleagues, acquaintances who have definitely had their share of experiences with the police that they feel, was either almost or overtly, profiling. And so, yeah, I've definitely had people espouse that.
It's it's such a tough thing or it seems tough to parse, because when you look at the number of unarmed Black men that have been shot by the police fatally, in 2019, for instance, there were 9 unarmed Black men that were shot and killed. There were 19 whites that were shot and killed. Of those 9 that were unarmed, that includes scuffles, fights that broke out between the police, and then that includes somebody who was in a vehicle, for instance, who may have been trying to injure a police officer, and they were shot and killed in that process. So the actual number of it almost feels like it's such a rare event in terms of fatalities, that we know their names. Like it's right. I mean, Tamir Rice, uh, um, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin. And Trayvon Martin wasn't by the police, but Eric Garner. So see, these names are in the public conscious, right? Yet over the yet over and I know this is brought up all the time. I'm not the first one to bring this up, but I'm curious to your thoughts as to why it's fair or unfair. Yet, over one Memorial Day weekend in Chicago, there are 41 mostly Black young men that are killed. Is it a fair statement, or is it incendiary somehow to say that the most dangerous person to a young Black man in America is not the police, but another Black man? Most of the homicides and most of the aggravated assaults, etc., in those neighborhoods, that in these homicides that happen, it's usually Black on Black violence.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And what a lot of people need to realize is that, so I agree in the broad sense that there's bigger problems at stake. And again, I always get a little wheezy when we play reductionist, because life is never that simple. I mean, if life were that simple, we would have solved everything by now. But in terms of, I think what we have to remember first is, in terms of white Americans and Black Americans, they mostly live in areas with mostly people like themselves. That's just natural. And so the reality is that most crime in America is intra-racial. racial, not interracial. So, I feel like a lot of people keep talking about black on black crime, but most murder victims of white people are by white perpetrators. Most murder victims of black people are by black perpetrators. That's a statistical reason. So I feel like we're being a little bit distortionist when we keep saying black on black crime as if it's unique, when in reality most white folks who die of homicide die at the hands of other white folks. You know, I mean, it's just because most white people live in areas with white people. So, when white people commit murder, the victims are mostly white. When black
Yeah.
people commit murder, the victims are mostly black. That's just the way it is. It's not. So I kind of, I, as a statistician, I kind of cringe a little bit when I hear people talk about black on black crime, because the reality is that most crime in America that involves violence, so homicide or any other violent crime, most crime is intra-racial. And that has to do with the fact that it comes back to another thing I said earlier. Although America has ended forced segregation, if you actually study America demographically and look at the geography of America and just go from city to city to city to city, you're actually going to see a lot of voluntary segregation, and it's something that I've noticed, over time as I've looked at the American geography. There's a lot of concentration, and it stems into the school districts, and so, yeah, I mean, that's my thoughts.
The
Yeah. So
sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
yeah, let's talk about that. I think you make a very good point here, David, and I think we should be, you know, happy to. I mean, happy, but we should. Let's say we can see there's a lot of racism and so forth. Um, one could say even if there were more black on black crime, that people could say, well, look, there's a lot of poverty among blacks, and that there are historical racial reasons for that, and so I think you're not off the hook, even if you point out that there's more black on black crime than they would than otherwise. But I think your point, David, is really valid. Now, what uh, can you tell us from your perspective, because on the books there are many laws, I mean, starting with the Civil Rights Act, that try to correct or to remedy, to be remedies for these systemic biases, to some extent. And do you find those helpful or not, or how do you view them? Do you think that the laws that essentially actually identifies people on the basis of the color of their skins or their race, there are laws that compel businesses, compel academia, compel different things to act differently on the basis of people's races, to try to remedy historical wrongs, or to try to remedy potential ongoing systemic biases. What's your view about that?
I have two take. I think a lot of people, I think sometimes I think it's overblown. And the reason why sometimes I think it's overblown is because the reality is that even with all the affirmative action, the reality is that when I was at Hopkins, I mean, it was 10% black. I mean, we weren't overrepresented relative to portion of the population. I mean, the overwhelming majority of students at Hopkins when I was there were white, in accordance with their representation in the population. And frankly, there's a lot of colleges in America, even in large cities, where the proportion of African Americans is actually even less than 10%. And that's even with affirmative action in place. So I feel like a little bit of the criticism of affirmative action, I feel like it's like on a purely intellectual level, I understand what people are trying to say. But when I open my eyes and just look at the numbers, I'm like, I mean, if if African Americans were 13% of the population and they were representing 26% of, Harvard and Yale, then you could argue, well, maybe the pendulum is swinging wildly, and unfairly in favor of African Americans versus Asians and whites. But the reality, statistically, is not that. The reality is that even at the universities in America that are practicing affirmative action in its most aggressive form, at least from what I see, looking at the numbers, I don't see an overrepresentation of African Americans. I still see a dominance. When you combine whites and Asians together, I see a dominance. So
No,
I'm not sure.
Actually,
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think I agree with you on that. But there might be two ways of interpreting it. One is that it's these laws are not effective enough, and more should be done in that direction. Or you might say, listen, this is sort of counterproductive, and the point that you were making, that there's this general tendency of communities to sort of self-segregate. Isn't it possible that we if we let, I mean, there may be ways in which I mean, if indeed these are different communities that have different cultures and different perhaps different aspirations and whatnot, that they should be allowed to evolve and in different ways. And I'm not sure, it's not a field that I have any knowledge about, but I'm told that there was perhaps some vitality in African American communities in certain ways before the before affirmative actions, and in certain ways that has been lost by this attempt to sort of forcibly distinguish, have the law forcibly distinguish people on the basis of their ethnic or their racial profile, and try to make the corrections. And if some people argue that the community would be better off without that it would, that certain laws are actually counterproductive, precisely because if there's systemic bias, it doesn't make the systemic bias go away. It actually gives it a different form, and there may be repercussions from
Yes.
trying to force these things that are not to the benefit of the people that it ostensibly is trying to help.
Yeah, so, actually an example that comes to mind, and then I'll answer your question directly, is on a separate issue that's no less contentious, which is abortion. And, before Roe versus Wade, so a lot of people, forget about history, but, before Roe v. Wade, there was actually an organic movement already occurring to liberalize rules concerning abortions. And then, even the great, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is certainly no conservative, she's an unabashed left of center Supreme Court judge. Her record speaks for itself. Her speeches speak for itself. She's clear that it's clear she's on the left. She's an abortion supporter. But even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in one speech, and I saw the quote once, she argued that Roe versus Wade paradoxically was bad for the pro-choice movement because it short-circuited an organic movement that was already on the way. And you can kind of see it. I mean, she's a sharp cookie and she's very smart. And she's holding her own even in her 80s. But you see it. You see Roe versus Wade has become this flashpoint that would never have existed if it never existed. If Roe v. Wade had never been, and instead the organic march, state by state, at the ballot box or through politicians, at the local level, if the way that abortion became quote unquote legalized was through an organic process, sequentially, state by state by state by state, yes, you might have had a few states still holding out, but in the states that it would have happened organically, there would be no opportunity to have this flashpoint in Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade, you know? So I use that as an example. Similarly with affirmative action, I believe that the affirmative action is trying to cover up a problem that started much earlier. And when I say early, I don't mean earlier in history. I mean earlier in the educational system. You know, the real disparity is really at K through 12. And so if, you know, if minority children and white children are going through vastly different K through 12 systems, papering that over at the collegiate level, to me, that's too late. And it's actually again, I'm not an opponent of affirmative action. I mean, if you put me in government tomorrow, I would not vote to end it. But my strong belief is it's too late. The problem is really K through 12. That's where intentional measures need to be taken. Because if you know, by the time a kid is 18 years old, if they went to an inferior high school, and then now you're trying to paper that over and kind of give them a little bit of a leg up so they get in a really strong school, I mean, did you really solve the problem, right? You probably didn't.
But if
you know?
if you take poor youth from poor zip codes, which unfortunately in America are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, and if you just put them into, you know, if you bust them and put them into, you know, good schools, would you just solve the problem? Is the problem just the education system that they're in? Look,
I don't. Go ahead.
I looked at the, you know, the numbers. The numbers are relatively stark in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia school budget is $3 billion per year for the Philadelphia school system. You know, that generally, that's approximately $20,000 per student per year. That's being spent by taxpayers on the Philadelphia public school system, which is, you know, which outcome wise does much more poorly than the wealthy suburbs. I live in one of those suburbs. I moved to those suburbs partly because the school system was good and I had the ability to do that. And you know, when you look at their budget and their numbers, you know, the gap in per student spending is $10,000 a year, $10,000 per student per year. So, you know, the Lower Merion School District is about $30,000 per student per year. But again, I mean, when you look at, you know, you look at the families that are in Lower Merion, you look at the families that are in inner city zip codes. How would one expect? It would seem very, very hard to get equal outcomes simply by taking a kid or even taking the family and putting them in, you know, just displacing them to another, not displacing them, but translocating them to, you know, a better zip code. I mean, that seems a tall order and doesn't seem something that would necessarily work.
Well, there's a couple of factors. You know, number one, there is a history in the country, unfortunately. Again, a lot of, you know, sometimes history does come back to bite us. There is a history of people in wealthier neighborhoods really not wanting those other people coming in. There is a history of that, and it's clear. I don't think it's going to be a magic bullet, but I do think, again, organically over time, if we really equalize the funding and the quality of teachers, which is partially related to the funding, if we semi-equalize that, if we really started to chip away at that, again, it's not going to be a magic bullet, but I feel like systemically over time, it would have an impact.
Why are we so
Um,
why are we so focused on equalizing outcomes for different groups? Meaning, I mean, there's certainly not just in the United States, but in various different societies. There are, in Malaysia, there's a minority Chinese population that economically does much better than the local native Malay population. Um, uh, so what is it about? So it's not just the case that the majority always suppresses the minority. That makes sense. It is the case that in many other countries and throughout history, it's been the case that minority populations have excelled relative to their peers. So and is it not the case that or is it again that inflammatory to believe that there are certain groups that may do things, may have different abilities relative to a variety of different things? Meaning, um, why is it that Indian Americans or Persians in the United States have somewhat of a different experience? Meaning, why is it that there are most of the most basketball players are black? With it, I don't think there's ever going to be an Indian NBA player. I almost had one a couple of years ago, but but I mean, is it unreasonable to believe that over the millennia of how things have gone, that even if you took the same Indians, okay, the same Indians with the same genetic blueprint, right? And I took one group of Indians and I put them on an island somewhere in the Indian Ocean, right? And I isolated them. And then 200 years later, we mixed them together. Doesn't it seem relatively obvious that you would have two groups of individuals that had different environmental selection over years, and you have very different affinities and desires? Not that there's any genetically inferior, there's no genetic inferiority that I'm suggesting, but I'm just saying that it just seems a natural result. And so why do we always want to chase equal outcomes?
well, that's a good point. And what I would argue is that we shouldn't be chasing equal outcomes. We should be chasing equal opportunity.
Hmm.
And there is a distinction. And I think that a powerful argument can be made that in many areas of the country, if the schools if the public schools in some zip codes are clearly, they're not even getting the same funding. So forget about outcomes.
Yeah.
They're not even getting the same funding. Then it's like they're not even starting off.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, David. In Philadelphia,
yeah, go ahead.
In the Philadelphia public school system, we're spending $3 billion per year on the Philadelphia public school system. Yes, that's different in Lower Merion, which is one of the most expensive school districts around. But we're spending $20,000 per student per year in the Philadelphia public school system, right? I come from India, and my God, think about what. Certainly, that's not necessarily a fair comparison with the developing country, but $20,000 per student per year is what the spend is in Philadelphia, and we're saying that if we expand that, we're suddenly going to. I don't know that these things are going to be magically fixed by additional funding. Even if we fund school districts equally, and it has to do with property taxes and how property taxes are very different in the cities but we still, the state funds. It's not that the schools are dilapidated, they're broken down, their teachers are I hear, again, I don't want to get in trouble, but I hear that the jobs in the public schools are more difficult, and therefore the best teachers go to the wealthier school districts, etc. That's what at least I hear. So I hear all that, but even if you accounted for all that, it seems a very tough road to travel in terms of getting close to that equal type of opportunity that we meaning, is equal opportunity the right to go to school, the ability to go to school, the ability to have shelter, the ability to fulfill some of these basic needs, but it seems like the issues are really systemic and deep when it comes to some of this stuff. One thing we had talked earlier before we got off, Michelle, I meant to finish this thing. We were talking about about. I don't want to stray too far from why we're having this conversation. We're having this conversation because of systemic, police, possibly institutional racism that exists within the police force that results in, kind of a heavy toll on the Black community in the United States. But when we talk about what it is that threatens the Black community, it's the case that Blacks die of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. That's a huge number. So I don't want to let go of that point of, you had pushed back and said that Black on Black violence, white on white violence, it's because of the voluntary segregation that's happening, which is an excellent point. But it's not. But I think it's probably not fair to say that the problem of homicide, the problem of criminal violence that the Black community has done, that carries a very heavy burden. That burden seems to be much heavier on the Black community than it is on the white community. Correct? So that's a big disparity. 8 times the Blacks die of homicide, 8 times the rate of white and Hispanics combined. I told you that the total number of unarmed Black men that died at the hands of the police in 2019 was 9, and many of those were unarmed, but they were not necessarily unjustified, if you will. So again, police shootings are not the reason that Blacks die of homicide. So I'm trying to understand, why is there this much rage then at what is frequently, I hear on Twitter and elsewhere, as a state-based kind of, state-sanctioned murder of a minority group?
Well, like I said, I mean, I think, and it's interesting because I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant, although you've been here a lot longer than I have. But I think, unfortunately, part of what makes it hard for both of us to fully understand, and we have to be honest in expressing that, is I think a lot of it goes deep. I think it cuts deep in a way that's not necessarily scientific. Not everything can be explained scientifically, but there's clearly, you don't need a PhD in sociology to see that there is something deep. And it was almost as if Mr. Floyd it was simmering, and that was just the final straw. That's what it seems like. I mean, yes, a lot of people are clearly exploiting it, and that's sad because unfortunately that doesn't help. It doesn't help at all. And that's one of the saddest things. But at the same time, there's something,
No, you're absolutely right. There's clearly a lot of anger, and clearly we have to do a much better job as a society in terms of trying to understand the rage, and hopefully have these type of productive conversations with nobody yelling and screaming, at each other, which I think doesn't happen often enough. So, David, I've taken up way too much of your time. We meant this to be an hour. It turned into, an hour, longer than an hour. So I really appreciate you coming on, and thanks again. I certainly found it incredibly productive and great. So we will see you on Twitter. Your Twitter handle is, go ahead, tell us.
OBStats Inc.
OBStats Inc. Excellent. So definitely a great follow, because he has incredibly thoughtful.
Send me the link to this podcast so I can put it on my website too.
Absolutely. Okay. Alrighty. Thanks again. All right. Take care.